parda, as much as there can be. Are all our mics working?
Yeah, looks like it.
Okay. So, it only makes sense to begin this session by asking both of you, why is there so much of discussion around writing about sex? Literary Review gives out the Bad Sex Award. Salon used to have what was called the Good Sex Award, and there is any number of debates in between about how sex should or should not be written about. Why do you think this is?
I think it makes us uncomfortable. Sex brings to the forefront so much of our anxiety. We don't usually talk about it. It's this really personal, intimate part of life that suddenly someone chooses to put words to, an experience that's pretty ineffable. And then we see the words printed in the page, and it's like all that anxiety is up there. And so we have to discuss the words and talk about them.
Also, perhaps because there isn't so much discussion about sex itself, that there is a lot of discussion about writing about sex. Makarand, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. First of all, can you all hear me at the back and in the front? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You see, what I want to say is that nothing sells like sex, as we know, in the modern society. And if you look at how sex gets commodified, in the West, it starts with Playboy and Hugh Hefner. And, and yet it seems as if there's so much confusion, mystery, anxiety, as you said, around sex, that it makes for a very tantalizing combination. It's almost as if human happiness now, in modern times, has been centered on sexuality. And yet, it would seem as if people are not having good sex. So, as somebody said, why is it so difficult to write about sex? It's because it produces either, it makes audiences either incredulous or envious. Especially, it makes audiences either incredulous or envious, especially if you're writing about good sex,
Yes.
Yeah. We'll come, I'm hoping to talk in some detail about the difficulties of writing about sex. But before that, I sort of wanted to just get your opinion on, I read somewhere that you once said that erotica is a sort of a more recent marketing trend. Do you feel that sex needs to be, it's important for sex to be organic to the poem or the novel, which it's being written into? And it should not be written gratuitously, so to say.
Well, it depends. If you're writing erotica, I just got hold of Aranyani's book this morning, and I've been reading it. It has a different, it seems to me, a different appeal and a different motive, and it's very hard to write erotica. You think about Anais Nin, and she writes about the struggle to pull it off, It's really complex, and of course it's a work of art, it's not just smut. Just raunch or smut would be pornography. So to write about sex in an aesthetic way is very difficult. But in India, it's a new market, and abroad, this 50 Shades of Grey, for example, is a best-selling book. So, everybody wants to do copycat versions of it in India. But to me, if you look at my own writing, then it's not erotica in the sense that it's not meant to stimulate or titillate or even explore sexuality per se. But to me, at least in my work, human sexuality becomes a part of human emotions, relationships, and it's also a way to knowledge about oneself. It's a way to self-knowledge, and in a way, knowledge about the other. So in that sense, my kind of great model, or not model, but the writer I'm inspired by, would be D.H. Lawrence. Though, of course, a lot of feminists, like Kate Millett and others have really sort of panned him for being such a sexist, bastard or whatever, pardon my language. But there was something very important that D.H. Lawrence tried to do. And I think that is really valuable. And in the Indian context, we haven't had many people do it. I mean, our great writers like Tagore, for example, or Premchand, never wrote about sex, except indirectly. And you needed somebody like Rituparno to tease out what happened in the bedroom, you know, in Chokher Bali or, you know, whatever, Binodini. So it was a work of imagination that but piecing together. But these great writers didn't write about sex. And the only ones who did in India were people like Khushwant Singh and Shobha Dey, you know. And I think that Khushwant Singh does it in a more complex way, especially in the book called Delhi, if you've read Delhi.
Yeah.
I think there's something going on there which is very powerful. And there's a lot of, I mean, symbolic use of sexuality, because the main character, Bhagmati, is a hermaphrodite, not a eunuch, but a hermaphrodite.
Yeah. You know, I wanted you to talk a little more about how you use sex as a tool, because that's something I found in your writing as well, and I think I'd agree with you there, to explore love and relationships and the value of sex as a tool to explore love and relationships on the whole.
Yeah, you know, I think that at least in my writing, especially in the new book, because in the earlier book, The Narrator, which I wrote many years ago, you know, there is a kind of, you might even say, a de-glamorization of sexuality. Because one of the characters in the book, he gets raped as a young boy, you know. But in this book, the second novel called Body Offering, I wanted to re-aestheticize sort of sex, you know. So it's like, you know, to go back to the Natya Shastra, see, you've got the Shringara Ras, okay, which is, in a way, it's the king of rasas, you know, it's the Pradhana Rasa. But the other side of Shringara is Bibhatsa. And what, in a way, I was trying to explore is that modernity sort of brings Bibhatsa or revulsion or disgust because of the pornographization of human sexuality, its commodification, its parading, its so-called misuse. So it's a very delicate job to bring it back and re-aestheticize it. But I think that basically for me, what one wants to capture is not sex as procreation or sex as recreation, but sex as transformation, you know. That's what at least I was trying to do.
Also in your poetry, which you haven't spoken about, when you're writing about sex, actually you're writing about what is going on between two people who are coming together or who are about to part ways, the inevitability of parting ways. Essentially, you're talking about man-woman relationship, and sex is incidental to, I mean not incidental, but it's a tool to kind of bring that out. Is that something that, I mean, that's what I got from reading your poetry. Is that something that you set out to do?
Yes, because I think that there's always a kind of toggling, you know, between rati and bhakti. You know, there's bridal mysticism in all traditions of the world. And I think the two go very closely together. You know, I mean, it's this whole, you know, ishq mazazi and ishq hakiki, or, you know, the same carnal love and sacred love in Christianity. And I think it's one of the great challenges of human civilization, how to somehow bring them together without, you know, this whole trip of guilt that in a way Christianity has. And I think for me, the great figure is Radha. And I mean, Jaydev in Geet Govind is somebody who can really bring it together, where Radha and Krishna are not merely human, they are not merely divine either. They are both. And the sensuality as well as the spirituality get blended in such a way that one doesn't deny the other. And in a way, that's what I was trying to do in the poems. But see, you brought in this idea of heteronormativity, you know, when you said that it's usually man-woman. But to me, man-woman, you see, these are flexible. In other words...
Sure, just as an example, yeah.
But what I'm saying is sexuality requires otherness, because attraction is based on otherness. It's not based on sameness. So even if it's same-sex love, you have to, you know, for one to be attracted to the other, there has to be difference. I think it's difference that is really erotic.
Yeah, otherness is not restricted to gender at all.
It can be class. It can be, I mean, I think in one of Aranyani's stories, I mean, this middle-class woman makes love to her maid servant.
The first story.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's a crossing of class. It's a crossing of the sort of heteronormative taboo. And it's liberative, you know, in a
Also,
way.
the other is difficult to define in the sexual sense. I mean, and that's half the fun of it, actually. That's half the mystery of it. But, you know, I wanted to ask you a little bit. Your book, on the other hand, is called A Book of Erotic Stories. Would you say that primarily what you set out to explore was sex and sexuality?
Women's
Yes.
ways in
Yeah.
sex and sexuality.
Yeah. And do you think that there is anything wrong per se in writing about sex for the sake of it?
If I did, I wouldn't have done it.
Well, I agree, which is why I'm asking you this question, but
I don't think there's any, you said sex for the sake of it, and for the sake of it makes it sound like sex stands alone, but I don't think sex ever stands alone. It's always against the social backdrop. It's always got the past. It's got the two people and their whole heritage around sex. It's a cultural moment.
sure. I mean, in no good writing can any subject stand alone. Essentially, if the writing is good, it's about a lot of things, you know. But I was talking about your motives as a writer. I mean, what is it that interests you when you start to write about sex?
It's related to what Makaran just talked about, which is sex's transformative potential. But I felt when writing about women, Indian women especially, having sex, I needed to take steps to get there. Because first there's education, which is actually in large part a denial of women's erotic agency and sexual impulse. Then there's a realization that this is what happens. Then there's mourning and then reclamation, all of which happens in the book. And then you can arrive at the sexual moment and think, well, I can be transformed by this too. But before that, I think women are not always naturally arriving at the sexual moment because there's been so much indoctrination, there's so much of the social conditioning. Rukmini Baya Nair has this wonderful poem called Gender Role, and she says, let the female body be your basic text and don't forget its slokas. And I think the slokas of the body are just tattooed all over women, and to be transformed there has to be not tattoos but something that's like a nyasa, right? In Sanskrit you can move the mantras, their placement through your mind, and I don't think we can arrive at that without this process of realizing, reclaiming, mourning, and then, yes, transformation. So that's why I think it deserved a whole book just to explore the sexual moment.
I hope we'll have many more from you. But, you know, to get to a little bit about the difficulties of writing about sex. To begin with, I'd like to begin with the question that is it harder to write about sex? You know, there's a woman called Toni Bentley. I don't know how many of you have read her, but she used to be a ballerina, and she's written quite a wonderful, very graphic memoir called Surrender. And she said that writing about sex is harder, like writing about its fellow intimacies, dance and prayer, because it's essentially a three-dimensional experience. So is that what makes it harder? I mean, the other thing that comes to mind, of course, is the limitation of vocabulary, the number of words available and what has been done, the way those words have been appropriated. You know, any thoughts on that?
The limitation in vocabulary, it is constraining. It's especially constraining working with the English language. There are a couple of places I use made-up words in the book. But I also like the challenge. I like the challenge of appropriating and taking back certain words. So you use cunt as a way to abuse a woman, but she uses it in a different way to talk about her body in ways that are very loving and aesthetic. So I enjoyed that part of the process. For me, what makes writing about sex hard is you have to feel your body if you're going to write about it. And so much of our modern day life, especially for women in public space, is disembodied. You have to dissociate from your body and how it's feeling, which is often scared, attacked, observed. And to come back and write about sex in a way that's loving, pleasurable, and aesthetic. I wrote most of the book at 4 a.m. It had to be really quiet and dark and kind of free of other people.
Yeah, I found that very interesting. I'll sort of second that from a slightly different point of view, which is that to be able to actually write well about sex is to know how to write well, first of all, which is not easy. But it also means that you've got to have experienced good sex, which I'm not sure everybody has, or a lot of people have, because of not just all this conditioning and containment, but the restrictions of life, which include the guilt associated with pleasure, the problems of monogamy. All these things are very real, and it doesn't mean that just because you cheat on somebody you're going to have good sex either. So it's a very complex thing. So to have experienced that for oneself is itself, I think, very important. But then good writing, whether it's about sex or about anything, is not just a sort of transcription of experience. It's actually imagination, because, in other words, it's almost like a parallel activity. It's almost like saying that you can write really well about sex, even if you've not even had sex, if you can actually just imagine it and feel it, and the very act of writing becomes so erotic,
Well, there's that popular legend that Vatsyayana never had sex.
Well, Vatsyayana too, but there's also this great story about Shankara, when he was in this debate with Mandana Mishra. And they said, look, you don't know one half of life because you've been celibate. So he, apparently, the legend goes, enters into the body of a dead king and goes to the harem, in that body. He revives that body and then experiences that whole aspect of life. But see, Vatsyayana's thing is a little bit like Masters and Johnson. There's a TV show going on. It's all about observation.
That's what I was telling you about, yeah.
But I'm not talking about merely observation. I'm actually talking about imagination, because a lot of human sexuality is really about that. It's about that act of feeling one's way into that state. But, even with Vatsyayana, I think Vatsyayana needs to be taken very seriously, because at the beginning of Kama Sutra, in the preface, there's actually a defense of pleasure. You see, Kama, because the cardinal virtues, Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha, it's an elaborate defense of Kama. Because if you look at, the tradition, it's usually they say that you have to overcome Kama, like even Shiva burns that Kama, and only then, because he opens the third eye, and then when Rati pleads, then it's kind of revived. Kama is revived, but he becomes Ananga, bodiless, because he's everywhere, Eros, that's Eros, Kama is Eros. So there's this great sort of anxiety over Eros, and see with Buddha, and a lot of, the traditional methodology for moksha is always about overcoming Kama and rejecting it as a way not to go. But Vatsyayana says, no, actually Kama can lead to Dharma. And so I'm saying so Vatsyayana really needs to be read, not just as a manual of positions or a description of sexual practices, which it is, which is, I think, really wonderful and very